Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt down here in the catacombs. We have a very special guest for you for Remnant TV's Remnant Underground today. We have a priest who I think is one of maybe two or three throughout the whole country who has decided, taken upon himself since the motu proprio of Pope Benedict XVI, to celebrate exclusively the traditional Latin Mass. And we're very, very pleased to welcome Father Michael Rodriguez to the set here today. Father, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Thank you. Now, thanks for being down here in the catacombs. You can see where we are. I think that the way things are going in the world and in the church, maybe it's not going to be that far removed from where we are now, or we will be looking for real catacombs. I don't know how you feel about that, but things aren't good right now, it seems.
I would agree that there are a number of signs that aren't that positive. I mean, particularly with what we see going on right now with the papacy. Obviously, the abdication of Pope Benedict the 16th, and at least some of the early signs right now that we see in the papacy of Pope Francis, not necessarily the most encouraging, but as faithful Catholics, first and foremost, we have to maintain a lot of hope in the promises of our Lord, and I think extremely important to continue to persevere in the work that we're doing to try to restore the faith and to restore the Mass.
Can you comment on that specifically? Because that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you come down here and talk to us today. The issue of the Mass. Now, we just came back from covering the conclave in Rome, and it just seemed like the issue of the restoration of the traditional Latin Mass was the great sort of 9,000-pound gorilla in the papals, inside the Vatican. No one wanted to quite talk about it or acknowledge it, but everyone was very aware that that was on everyone's mind. And I'm referring, of course, to Pope Benedict's, restoration of the traditional Latin Mass to the extent that he did. For example, in your diocese in El Paso, do you see any evidence over the past few years of what the traditional Mass did in terms of vocations or anything else, just sort of reintroducing it under the reign of Pope Benedict XVI?
I think particularly with vocations, it's especially clear the great benefits of the traditional Latin Mass. I mean, we might say practical benefits, because I think that obviously there are going to be benefits across the board in terms of the spiritual well-being of the church, both individual Catholics and the church as a whole, but particularly with vocations, because there in El Paso, our diocese, unfortunately, it's probably, I would guess, in the entire country, particularly in the last 15 years, at the bottom in terms of vocations, not just vocations to the priesthood, but ordinations to the priesthood per capita, because it's a diocese that has over 600,000 Catholics, probably closer to 700,000 Catholics. And between the years of 1999 and 2009, we only had 2 men ordained for the diocese. So, I mean, that's
not great.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that's a staggering statistic, but staggering obviously in the negative sense. Mm-hmm. And we continue to have great struggles in terms of vocations to the priesthood and religious life. But interestingly enough, when I was offering the Latin Mass at my parish, my former parish there in El Paso, San Juan Bautista, I'd say pretty much between the years 2007 and 2011, so we're talking about, let's say, a 4-year span, it was truly remarkable the number of vocations to the priesthood and religious life that came out of that parish, and it was a very, very small parish, one of the smallest in the diocese. Now, granted, we were getting people that were coming to Mass there from different parts of the diocese, so I mean, it wasn't just restricted to the small geographical area of the parish. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, I'd say probably we had anywhere from 6, 7 vocations to the priesthood, probably a little bit more, maybe closer to 10 over that
How many years
span.
is that?
4 years.
4 years.
And 2 women that right now are in convents, and then a far greater number of interest that was being shown, I mean, in those vocations, I would say easily into the teens. And even right now, I mean, a few years later, we still have a number of the faithful that were going to Mass at San Juan that are still looking into the seminary. There's one young man in particular that there's a good chance he might be entering the seminary with the priestly fraternity of St. Peter in the fall that was going there to San Juan. And so we just have a number of those examples. And basically, during that 4-year span, those vocations from the parish of San Juan Bautista far outnumbered the vocations to priesthood and religious life of the rest of the diocese combined.
Wow. Now, when you see something like that, that has to happen in your priestly life, where the traditional Mass doesn't become or doesn't remain just a matter of a preference for you. Is that accurate? In other words, you
Definitely. I mean, definitely, because they're firsthand. And I mean, I had more experience in terms of with vocations to the priesthood and religious life because I was actually the director of vocations. I was the vocation director for the diocese for a year and a half earlier, back in my first years as a priest in 1998 and 1999. And I saw how difficult it was to promote vocations to priesthood and religious life. It's not easy. I mean, it's tough. That in itself, though, should tell you that we've got some problems, very serious problems in the church right now because God's always faithful. And if we're not getting a greater number of vocations, both in, it's not just quantity, but also quality, well, the problem is not on God's side, but it's on man's side.
Sure.
But so I knew how difficult it was, and then all of a sudden, I was there offering the traditional Latin Mass and trying to restore the Catholic faith, and all of a sudden I'm witnessing this blossoming of vocations, particularly seeing many, many young men being drawn to the holy sacrifice of the Mass, being drawn to the faith, and being drawn also in particular to the priesthood. I mean, really seeing the priesthood as something holy, something sacred, something with something heavenly, and aspiring after that. It was obvious to me this is not my work. I mean, it wasn't like I was doing things very differently in terms of, let's say, as a priest from one day to the next. It was evident that it's the grace of God and the grace of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. I mean, the grace of the traditional Latin Mass. And that's one very evident example of how what you're saying, it's not just a question of, well, I prefer the Latin Mass, or I prefer the Novus Ordo, or I prefer the smells and bells, and incense and, little bells ringing. It goes far beyond that. I mean, it's a question of what really is the true Mass of our Catholic faith, and how is our worship really expressing our Catholic belief. I mean,
and we see this, don't we? With it's not just your opinion or mine or the opinion of traditionalists nationally or internationally. Isn't this precisely what Pope Benedict said shortly before abdicating, and back in February when he used the word trivialized? He said what's happened to the liturgy since the council is it's been trivialized. So I don't think it's necessarily just laymen, or in your case a priest, who are sort of speculating, we don't like this Mass the way it is. Even the Pope has come out and admitted it's been trivialized. And maybe it's that trivialization of the liturgy that's led to the problems that we have in terms of vocations.
Yes, I mean, I think it's definitely true. The Pope Benedict, I think, tried to do a lot to bring a restoration of a sense of the sacred to the liturgy. I think you could see that he was working towards that, and I think it was obviously good in helping the church. At the same time, I suspect that whole issue, like you referred to it earlier about the elephant there in Rome in the living room, I suspect that also his efforts to promote the traditional Latin Mass and even promote reforms to the Novus Ordo had something to do with his abdication. But yes, I think he is another example of one, obviously very important for us. I mean, our former Holy Father, of trying to bring we might say more objectivity to the liturgy. I mean, in the sense of recognizing it's not just personal preferences. I mean, this is the liturgy of the church, and it's not just. I think an important point needs to be made. it's not just the liturgy of the church of a particular period. I mean, the liturgy is something that goes far beyond even our post-conciliar period, which is something that I think many Catholics have to reflect on more seriously, because even if all of us got together in the 1960s or 1970s, or even now in the early 21st century, and we kind of came up with this idea that this is the way we want the liturgy to be, or these are changes that we think should be made, there's even a greater objectivity to the liturgy than that, in that it spans all centuries and all time, and is really ultimately a participation in the heavenly liturgy. It's outside of time.
And the extent to which the new liturgy no longer reflects that, or as Benedict called it, to the extent that it's being trivialized.
And manipulated.
And
I would
manipulated.
say, I think very important, manipulated. I like also, I would say, trivialized and manipulated.
And manipulated. So a priest such as yourself, and I think it's so important for people to realize this now. We are in dire times. We're down here in a catacomb, but the church is going into another phase that's very similar to the one 2,000 years ago. And so to say that to be a traditional Catholic priest nowadays is merely a matter of preference, it seems to me is a little bit simplistic. In other words, you were saying the old Mass, I understand, and the new Mass for a time, and at some point you said, I can no longer say the new Mass. And I bet you our viewers would love to know what it was that made you say, I can no longer say the new Mass, or choose no longer to say the new Mass.
A couple of things. I would say one, just a growing conviction on my part. I mean, the more that I offered the traditional Latin Mass, the more I became convinced that this is the true Mass of the Catholic Church, and how necessary it is to restore it, not just for my own priesthood and, let's say, for my own spirituality, but for the good of Holy Mother Church. I mean, and to really restore the faith and the spirituality of the Church as a whole. So it was a growing conviction that I would say wasn't overnight. I mean, over the course of, let's just say, a few years, I just was becoming more and more convinced of that. And then I would say also my transfer, when I was transferred away from El Paso, in many ways, it's been a great blessing. I can't probably go into all the details right now, because I've seen a lot of what I call little miracles that God has done over the past year and a half in that regard. But one of the great blessings, I think, was precisely that with my transfer, that also affected the way that I saw this whole issue of the Mass, because on the one hand, it made it a little bit easier, practically speaking, for me to make the switch 100% to the traditional Latin Mass. And at the same time, with everything that was involved with my transfer, I saw even more clearly how deeply rooted the problems are in the Church, both in the Church as a whole, but also in the hierarchy, where you might almost say it was like the last straw, where I said, you know what, I've got to take this step for the good of the Church. And I think that's also, I think, the big factor, that it was far more than just, I would say, even just a personal decision, but saying, for the good of my diocese and for the good of the Church as a whole, I have to do everything that I can to restore, the traditional Latin Mass and also the faith, because Church doctrine is also extremely important. It's not just the liturgy; they both go together. It's the doctrine that needs to be restored, which obviously, I mean, is part of why I also made that change, because I don't know how many of you viewers are familiar with my particular case, but certainly Church doctrine had a lot to do with that, because I was doing the best that I could to defend the sacredness of the sacrament of marriage, and in teaching very clearly that homosexual relationships are a grave sin, and that the Catholic Church is 100% against that grave sin. And that obviously was, I think, a big factor in my transfer. But in proclaiming faithfully the church's teachings, I directly experienced maybe the greatest opposition from within the church.
Yeah, boy.
We might say from the hierarchy itself, which again really just drove home the point to me how desperately we need our faith back, and how desperately we need the Mass back, how desperately we need our sacraments back, how desperately we need our discipline back. There's just so much that we've lost, and whatever sacrifices I have to make or whatever risks I have to take, well, it's time to make them. So I mean, all of this was kind of coming together at the time that I was transferred. And as I said, also, I had already been offering the Latin Mass for a number of years up to that. And it was also definitely, I would say, affecting my priestly soul in just seeing the beauty and the richness and the truth of the Mass. So.
Yeah, and it seems like with respect to, I guess we're getting a signal here. We don't have a tremendous amount of time left, but I really wanted to make this point or ask you to make the point rather with respect to, Benedict, the animosity towards our Holy Father. I don't think you would claim, and I know I don't claim that he was a rock solid traditionalist in every sense of the word, but he did recognize that there was a problem, and liturgically he did really try to use the papacy to and use his pontificate to try to restore some sanity to the liturgy, so that we would have people who would then begin to hopefully, I think, believe as they pray. Why is it then that even now you get the sense since the last conclave now that there's a sense of jubilation that's over? That Benedict, who really did do something liturgically that made a lot of difference in the lives of priests and the lives of the faithful, why is it that even inside the Vatican, you have cardinals that seem to be, Cardinal Mahony, for example, celebrating the fact that he's done, that Benedict is over, and now we can go back to the way things were, when it was obviously working with priests such as yourself, restoring the liturgical heritage, helped to restore Catholic identity, which should be the name of the game. Is it still the name of the game? Do they really want to restore Catholic identity, or is it just, have they thrown it all to the wind?
I think, sadly, that there are many, many, many prelates, and again, going up to the highest levels, I think many cardinals, that I think it's very sad, but I think it's also in line with what our Blessed Mother came to warn us with in Fatima. I think there are many that have lost the faith. I think there are many that have lost the faith. I think that there are many that their priority and their hopes do not have really anything to do with the salvation of souls. I think they have a very worldly agenda, and I think we also need to ask ourselves as priests, as bishops, as lay faithful, why? Because I think that's going to go back to just the whole issue of the Mass and the restoration of our faith. How can it be that we have so many within the church, even in high positions of authority, that basically have lost the faith? How can that be? And I think it's going to go back to the question of how we worship. There are other factors obviously involved, but I think that's a big one. And the fact that you see, like you say, this kind of continued, I think we could say continued, let's say, animosity against Pope Benedict, I think just shows two things. One, how grave the crisis in the church is and how grave the crisis of faith continues to be, and how this really is an issue, as you said at the very beginning. It's not being talked about, or it hasn't been talked about very much since the election of Pope Francis. Kind of our attention has been shifted to other things, but I think it still remains the big issue for the church in the years to come. And hopefully more and more of the faithful will begin to ask themselves some important questions. And I think some of those important questions are, one, what really is the Mass? Because I think there's so many Catholics that don't even understand the basics of the Mass as far as it truly being the sacrifice of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It's made present and made real. But asking themselves, what is the Mass? asking more serious questions about the state of the church and the causes for it, and then making more of an effort to look, I would say, even just at the origins of the Novus Ordo Missae. I mean, to say, well, how did this new Mass come up? I mean, where did it come from? And really comparing, we might say historically, you might even say like the historical origins of the new Mass and a lot of the new Catholicism that we have in the church today with what is of perennial value, with the origin, we might say, of the traditional Latin Mass of the Roman Rite, which has always been the Mass of the Church. Hopefully, the events that we're seeing, I mean, again, like I say, the continued crisis, questions that a lot of people have, let's say even now about the papacy, will hopefully be motivation for us to recover our faith.
Yeah, right. Especially when you consider how some of these things like altar girls came to be, where you already had a breakdown in the chain of command. And so you had Pope John Paul, who was against altar girls. And yet he says, well, I guess to the extent that it's already happening in the Netherlands or in Germany or wherever, it can go on there as an option. But he didn't actually institute altar girls or say from now on we're going to have altar girls. He tolerated it because he no longer had the ability to do anything to stop it where there was rebelling against what he was trying to do, correct? So now when we see the crisis that the church is in, like you say, we go back and maybe re-examine how some of these things came about. How did we end up with altar girls? It hasn't helped vocations, and it's just been the opposite.
I think a lot of important questions have to be asked, and hopefully the remnant down here in the catacombs will have some a degree of shelter, we might say, or installation to be able to ask those questions, because what you just touch upon in terms of the whole question with the altar girls in Pope John Paul II, I think is part of what we have as the what I would call the problem of collegiality, in that I think that's an issue also that needs to be looked at a lot more in depth by serious Catholics, because my perspective on it, and again, somewhat limited, I mean, I can't say too much right now, but I would say I think a lot of the problems that we have in the church today are also because church authority has not been respected and church authority has not been exercised. Mm-hmm. And so the solution is to restore that respect and love and reverence for church authority, to exercise that authority faithfully for the sake of Christ. I mean, for the sake of Christ's kingship. I mean, for the sake of Catholic truth. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's why authority has to be exercised. I mean, our Lord gave his apostles the mandate and the authority. I mean, he gave them the mandate to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, and also gave them that authority. I mean, he gave them his own authority, but he gave them that authority for a very specific mission, to teach the truth. And there's only one truth that saves, the Catholic truth. And so we have to restore, I think, that church authority and the proper exercise of that church authority. And it almost seems like we're doing the opposite, where even, I think, unfortunately, it's still too early to say, but at least some of the initial signs that we see on the part of our Holy Father Pope Francis, it seems that he's kind of trying to promote, we might say, even more collegiality.
More of the same. Yeah.
Where I think all the signs are pointing to, we've been going down a misguided path, and we have to restore, we might say, the church authority, beginning obviously with the Pope himself. I mean, obviously beginning with the Pope, and then obviously the bishops, priests, fathers in their homes, and the Catholic father, Catholic husband and father in his home.
So we got about 30 seconds, Father, at the most. As far as Pope Francis is concerned, I'm assuming you're kind of taking the same tack most of us are taking, that it's a little bit too soon to tell what to expect, but we must presume and hope for the best, right? And,
I agree. I mean, he's our Holy Father, and I think as faithful and loyal Catholics, we have to pray a lot for him. I think there's great challenges that he's facing. I think we have to be realistic in terms of, if we're really trying to restore the faith in the Mass, there are signs that don't look too encouraging, but we have to continue to hope and persevere, pray hard, and keep doing the work we're doing. Keep doing
it up, yeah, okay. Father, thanks so much for stopping down in the catacomb today. I hope you come back and see us again soon.
You're very welcome.
Thanks very much, okay. All right, for Father Rodriguez, I'm Michael Matt for Remnant TV. Thanks very much for joining us.